In 2001, Apple introduced the original iPod, and in 2014, after 6 different generations and 13 years of production, they finally discontinued it because they were no longer able to get the hard drives that were required to make the device. But I think that it's a fair assessment to say that over those 13 years, this iPod was iconic. And today, I want to go ahead and compare the first generation iPod to the last generation iPod. We're going to be doing firsts and lasts to see what changed in that long run for this device. For a bit of history, when the original iPod was introduced in 2001, it was meant to strike a balance between the massive and high capacity, but often not convenient to use MP3 players of the time that used optical media, and the smaller, easier to carry around, but insanely expensive and very low capacity flash MP3 players of the time. Plus, it was also, of course, taking shots at the CD player market, and I think it's fair to say that this really did succeed in hitting all of those goals. Because if you look at flash MP3 players of the time, these things were very low capacity. Unless you really compressed your audio and made it sound horrible, you were talking maybe an album on that thing. And when it came to the higher capacity optical media MP3 players, yeah, you could fit a ton of music, like an ungodly amount of music for the time on there, but they were huge. There was no way on earth you were going to be able to put that thing in your pocket. You would be carrying it in a purse if you were lucky. But the first gen iPod was about the size of a deck of cards and could hold 1,000 songs. That was literally the pitch, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that just took off. Now, when it comes to the last generation of iPod, now called the iPod Classic, this was introduced in September of 2007, which, if you're keeping track, was only a few months after the introduction of the iPhone. Now, it's very clear by how the iPhone was pitched that, yeah, this thing was still Apple's big moneymaker. The iPod was the go-to. But with hindsight being 2020, it's pretty clear that the days were numbered as soon as the iPhone hit the market. But I mean, it's pretty clear looking at this iPod that 6 generations is a lot of time to make a lot of improvements, and we're going to look at all of those today. But first, I want to make a note here. Technically, the last iteration of the iPod Classic was the 7th generation, or 6th generation revision 2, depending on who you ask. The biggest differences were that they killed off the black color back in 2007 and replaced it with exclusively gray models from 2008 to 2009. These were notes that were given to me by Austin, which, oh yeah, by the way, Austin's a friend of mine and a friend of the channel here. He runs Obsolete Electronics, both the website and the YouTube channel. This video is not sponsored or anything, but when I threw the idea his way about doing this comparison video, he sent over this first generation iPod with a fresh battery, no questions asked. So again, not sponsored, but if you want to go to EOE Works, which I'll link in the description, you can pick up your own iPod, whether it's custom, not custom, whatever you want, you can go pick it up on his site. So huge thanks to Austin. Now let's go ahead and get back to the video. So starting off, let's go ahead and take a look at the outside of these iPods. And right away, you can tell that the original iPod is quite the thick boy, and there was a 10 gig version that was even thicker. Part of this difference was because of the battery technology. The original battery ran down the entire back of the iPod, whereas in later generations it was a smaller unit up towards the top of the case. As for the materials, the original iPod was made of a stainless steel back with a plastic top, and this actually made it really easy to mod, or at least maintain, because it comes apart really easily. The last generation, the iPod Classic, this is aluminum with a steel backplate. Now, that does make it feel significantly more premium, and overall, it does seem to be a little more durable in my experience. I have beaten up some plastic iPods, and I've beaten up some aluminum iPods, and the aluminum ones, if it's not too bad, always usually come out looking a little bit better. But this also means that maintenance on these iPods is a nightmare because aluminum doesn't bend, plastic does. So you can just bend plastic tabs out of the way, take the iPod apart, but on the aluminum one, that's not an option. You're fighting for your life to get this thing to come apart. I prefer the plastic ones for how easy they are to work on, but I like the aluminum for how they look, so I'm kind of torn. Now moving on to the screens on these devices, the original iPod was equipped with a 2-inch monochrome 160 by 128 pixel screen with 3 LED backlights. Like, this thing was basically the Casio F91W display of the iPod world. It was basic, but it got the job done. Fun fact though, even though this was a very low resolution display, you could actually have different language characters on there like Japanese or Chinese. I was really surprised by that. Moving to the iPod Classic's display though, there's no competition. This is a much better display. It's a 2.5-inch full color display with a full backlight, and it's 320 by 240. You could actually watch videos on this thing, which we'll talk more about in a bit. Having this full color display means that you can see album art, again you can see videos, you can also see photos, which was actually introduced back with the iPod Photo, but obviously that was a feature that was still carried forward. This full color display though does draw more power, so it has a backlight timer, and if you leave it sitting long enough, it'll actually go into this sort of lock status, play pause status, time display, just to kind of save power, whereas the low power nature of that monochrome display on the original iPod just lets it leave up everything, whole thing, album, play status, everything. Or I should say song name, it's not showing you an album cover. Now when it comes to the interface that you're going to be using on these displays, Apple kind of nailed the core idea of the iPod interface right out of the gate, and the only thing that they did over the years was add flourishes and embellishments. That's really about it. I mean, look at how you navigate the first generation iPod. You scroll through, pick your song, or pick your album, or pick your artist, and basically just navigate up to the point where you're playing music. That is it. It's a very, very simple interface. Now take a look at the iPod Classic, and it's navigated the exact same way. Scroll, click, play song. Now, there are some things added courtesy of the color display, like being able to see the album art when you look at albums, having cover flow, which is one of my favorite features on this iPod, and when you're just sitting on the home screen, it'll just play or pan through a bunch of different album art on the right side of the display. That's nice, but the actual navigation is exactly the same as it was back in 2001. Now when it comes to the input method for navigating this interface, you might notice that they are very different while still having some similarities. The interface on both iPods is navigated with a click wheel. You roll your finger around the outside of the wheel, it spins to whatever you're trying to go to, you click it, you also have a menu option for going back, you have fast forward, rewind, and play. However, you'll see that on the original iPod, those buttons are around the outside of this click wheel, and on the iPod Classic, those buttons are now integrated. On the first generation iPod, not only was the click wheel and the button set separate, but the click wheel itself physically spins. That was actually something that was immediately changed to a touch-style interface when they got to the second generation of the iPod. But this first generation literally has a physically spinning click wheel, which, interestingly enough, if you move the iPod too quickly while you're just walking around or whatever, you can unintentionally scroll because the wheel is just freely spinning. The lock button actually has a genuine use in this case. As for the click wheel in the iPod Classic, with all the buttons being integrated, that style of click wheel was actually introduced on the iPod Mini and was such a great design that it was just carried forward to all the iPods afterwards, or I should say, all the iPods that use a click wheel afterwards. It's also, from everything I can tell, a lot more durable because it's just one integrated touch surface with buttons, whereas a physically spinning click wheel could introduce the potential for dust in the spinning mechanism. Yeah, I think that the click wheel design that they ended with is significantly better than the click wheel they started with, but that's just my opinion. But now with the display, the interface, and the click wheel, what can these iPods actually do? Well, with the original iPod, it was literally 1,000 songs in your pocket. Listen to 1,000 songs in your pocket, and there were some extras. Like literally, it is just called extras in the interface. And if you go in there, you can see clock, contacts, calendar, and games. You can sync over contacts and calendars from your Mac, and when it comes to the clock, it's just the clock. Literally just shows you the time. And games, well, games, it's one game. You can play Breakout on this iPod, and if you don't know why Breakout is important to Apple, it's the first game that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak worked together to develop for Atari. And yeah, you can just play it on the iPod. Now looking at the iPod Classic, it has the exact same music functionality as the original iPod. Obviously, that's what these were meant to do, but there is a lot more. This thing's got photos, videos, and multiple games built in, along with all the other capabilities of syncing contacts, calendars, and the like. Plus, in the clock mode now, you actually have a stopwatch and a timer. You can also sync over notes from your Mac the same way that you could sync over contacts and calendar dates, and you can even add more games. You can't really do that anymore because the game store is kind of dead, but you could back in the day, and it also has a lock screen. Kind of crazy how many things were actually added to this interface while still keeping the exact same core navigation and simplicity of the interface. But now speaking of syncing your iPod to your Mac, How do you do that? Well, on the original iPod, it was FireWire, and there was an interesting reason for this. See, nowadays everything's basically USB, but back when the iPod was introduced, USB was on USB 1 or 1.1 if I remember correctly, and that could not do syncing and charging. FireWire, on the other hand, could, and on top of that, FireWire was significantly faster than the first iteration of USB. You see, USB 1 was capable of 12 megabits per second with basically no power delivery, whereas FireWire 400, get this, was capable of 400 megabits per second and also capable of power delivery. So for Apple, it was a no-brainer. That was the port to go with for this iPod. But now looking at the iPod Classic, Apple went with the 30-pin dock connector introduced back with the 3rd generation iPod. This is USB capable, older models were actually FireWire and USB capable, and now that USB was capable of power delivery and also roughly the same, even a little bit more data speed than FireWire 400, it made sense to go with this port. And nowadays, it is significantly easier to find devices with USB than it is to find devices with FireWire. And even if you can find devices with FireWire, chances are it's FireWire 800, which means you need to adapt it down to 400. And on the subject of finding computers to plug these iPods into, it is a lot harder to do so with the original iPod, especially if you're using a Mac, because current versions of macOS do not support data transfer over FireWire. You can get power, so if you run a bunch of adapters, you do get power delivery, but you do not get any data transfer capabilities over FireWire. So basically your options are a PC with a FireWire card, so it would probably end up having to be an older PC anyway, or an older Mac running an older version of macOS that has some version of FireWire on it, whether it be 400 direct or 800 adapted down to 400. Kind of unfortunate, so yeah, if you're trying to use an original iPod in the modern day, getting stuff onto it is a royal pain in the butt. In fact, for this video, I had to use music that was already on this iPod because at the time of recording, I don't have a computer that can put data onto this iPod. On the other hand, the same is not true about the iPod Classic. This thing still shows up on every version of macOS that supports it from when it was introduced to now. I've even plugged this thing into macOS Golden Gate, shows up right away, no problems whatsoever. It is, in my opinion, easier to load music onto it using an older version of macOS that still has iTunes or a version of Windows with iTunes on it, but you can still load music onto this thing with Apple Music. You can load videos onto it if they're formatted right off of the Apple TV app, and of course you can change all your settings and everything through the Finder app. So yeah, over the 25 years that have elapsed since the original iPod came out, it's gotten pretty difficult to put things onto the iPod or plug it into any modern machine, but that's to be expected of a 25-year-old device. However, you can still completely use an iPod Classic in the modern day. So if you are looking to use an iPod in the modern day, something with a 30-pin dock connector, I would recommend later into the 5th or 6th generations, work just fine if you have iTunes on Windows or Apple Music on the Mac. Now, when it comes to modern use for the iPod, not just in being able to use it in a modern OS, but also just use it as an MP3 player in the day-to-day, I highly recommend basically any iPod from the 4th gen, either monochrome or color, all the way out to the generation that I've been talking about in this video, the 6th/7th gen. This iPod Classic that I've been featuring in the video is literally my daily driver iPod. It's flash modded, which, by the way, mods are abundant for these iPods and many iPods. In fact, if you go to EOE Works, you can get all kinds of mod parts. You can get one pre-modded, tons of different stuff, so you can make this thing your own. You can even software mod these to have Rockbox, but here's the thing with that. I like the original interface for the iPod. It was originally designed to be a simple, great music listening interface, and it is still that. The way it was designed back when it first came out is still the way that it works. It didn't change, it wasn't slowed down or affected by updates in any way. It is just the way that it was originally intended. When it comes to the 1st generation iPod and modding and modern use, yeah, it's doable. You can use this in the modern day. I was listening to music, and again, even if this thing is 25 years old, it was designed to be a great music listener, and it still is. But at this point, modding this thing would almost feel like defacing a piece of history. The only thing that I would want to open this up for is to change the battery in it, and maybe flash mod it, but again, having a hard drive in this thing that works is, again, on its own, kind of a museum piece. I don't know, maybe I'm too sentimental about the original and not as sentimental about the classics, but for me, I really like using, and I find it a lot easier to use, an iPod Classic in the modern day than I do using one of these. But if you did, it's still a great music player. But the last thing, and yes, this video is very long and I saved this for last on purpose, is the listening experience. How do these actually sound? Well, this actually is a very talked about and in some cases heated discussion between iPod users. See, the first generation iPod uses a Wolfson DAC. In fact, a lot of iPods used a Wolfson DAC. This is known for being a bit warmer, a bit more open, what a lot of people consider to be a more comfortable sound profile. I find it warm, but here's what I'm talking about. A warmer sound profile looks like this. And the thing with that is this EQ, the sort of general sound that you get from this DAC, works really well with mid-grade headphones, mid-grade speakers. It has a very pleasant sound if you're not looking to do critical listening or you're not looking for a kind of true to the audiophile experience. And that makes sense because this iPod was meant to be for the masses. The headphones that it shipped with were honestly garbage, but it does make them sound decent when you have this kind of sound profile, and any mid-grade headphone is going to sound good with this sound profile. You can even get some cheaper headphones to sound okay, but if you're really looking for the audiophile experience, well, the Classic is kind of where it's at. See, when the iPod Classic was introduced, it switched from the Wolfson DAC, which a lot of iPod users consider to be the best one, to a Cirrus Logic DAC, and that was a much more flat sound profile. It didn't add anything, or it didn't add a lot, to the audio file that was being played. It was trying to be as true to the source as possible, and for people who were using cheap or mid-tier headphones, that didn't sound as good. And that's because the Cirrus Logic DAC didn't bring up the areas where these headphones were weakest. So if your headphones were weak in the bass or weak in the trebles, you didn't get that smiley face curve that would really improve those areas. You got a flat sound profile, and so that weak bass or that weak treble really reared its ugly head in those cheaper headphones. But the moment you plug in a really nice set of headphones, whether it be reference monitors, reference speakers, or really any high-grade headphones that also don't add anything to the mix but just give you a wide range of sound that can be presented through the speakers, it is a night and day difference, and this iPod sounds fantastic through those headphones. At the end of the day, as we've seen, 13 years is a massive amount of time to make a ton of improvements, and it's very clear that Apple made good use of that time. From this iconic, but obviously now dated iPod design to the last generation made that has basically all of the refinements that Apple learned over the years, including, of course, that gray silver aluminum to match all of the Apple products of that time. I think that this last iPod they made was a fitting send-off, and I think the first one was a very, very good first step. Either way, that's been it. Thank you so much for watching this long but very fun to make video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully maybe I reignited your interest in iPods. And if I did, maybe check out the link down below to EOE Works where you can get your own iPod, either custom or standard. And again, huge shout out to Austin for sending over this iPod original. This thing was the main reason I wanted to make this video, and he made it possible. And he also made another first and last video possible with something else that he sent over. So definitely make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. And maybe like this video if you want to see more content like it and you want to support the channel. Definitely leave some comments about your Apple history, iPod history, MP3 player history, whatever you want to do. Some calm, rational discourse in the comments down below. And a huge shout out to these names over here for supporting the channel. These are the members of the Army of Steel, $3 a month. These folks keep the channel running, keep the lights on, keep things moving when things get a little slow. You get monthly wallpaper drops, emojis, badges, and discounts in my store, one of which is going to be a new design coming out soon featuring the click wheel of the original iPod. So definitely make sure to check that out if you're interested. And aside from that, I will see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to be there and have a good one.